This is Emma and Olivia. They're identical twins, which means they share the exact same genetic information. At birth, their mom had a hard time telling them apart. Same eye color, same height, same hair. 10 years later, it became easier to spot differences. Emma grew a little taller than Olivia and loved math. Olivia, on the other hand, had a slightly deeper voice and could spend hours dancing. By the age of 20, the two young women still looked very similar, but their personalities were now completely different. Emma smoked and preferred to stay home with a book. Olivia loved to stay active, taking yoga classes and mountain biking on weekends. 30 years later, telling them apart was no longer a problem. Emma developed rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic disease that causes painful inflammation in the joints. Olivia didn't have arthritis, but she had more gray hair and more sunspots on her skin than her sister. So how is this possible if they share the exact same genes? Could there be something above genetics? Our DNA is like a cookbook, where each gene is a recipe to make one or more proteins. At the beginning, Emma and Olivia each received the same instruction manual. Their books were identical, but over time, they could highlight some parts of the text, cross out lines, add sticky notes, or write in the margins. Slowly, the pages used, the notes added, and the ignored parts became different. The recipes are the same, but they're not read the same way anymore. That's where epigenetics comes in. If DNA is the cookbook, epigenetics is all those little marks and notes, the highlights, sticky notes, and margin scribbles. These marks appear over the course of life in response to the environment, diet, or personal experiences. Epigenetics doesn't explain all the differences between Emma and Olivia, but it sheds light on many of them. An adult body contains billions of cells. If we tried to count them one by one at 1 cell per second, it would take almost 1 million years. And yet, all of these cells come from a single one, the zygote, created when mom's egg met dad's sperm. Because they all come from this one cell, every cell in our body carries the exact same DNA. Skin cells, brain cells, kidney cells, muscle cells, they all carry the same genetic code. In that sense, they're like identical twins, and still, they look very different and play very different roles. So how do cells know what type they are, and why do they only perform the functions of that type? The answer is epigenetics. Epigenetic marks are tiny molecules that attach to DNA or to the proteins around it. They act like switches, turning some genes on and others off without changing the genetic code itself. For example, every cell in our body has the genes to make stomach acid, which is crucial for digestion. Stomach cells use those genes all the time. But imagine if skin cells started producing stomach acid. It would literally burn our skin. Thankfully, that doesn't happen, because in skin cells, those genes are switched off by epigenetic marks. When cells specialize in a process called differentiation, they receive a unique epigenetic profile. This profile tells them which genes should be expressed and which ones must stay silent forever. But epigenetic control isn't always all or nothing. Often, it works more like a volume knob. It can turn gene activity up or down, making regulation much more precise. Which raises the question, who controls the volume? Our genetic code is the sequence written in DNA. Except for a few mutations, it stays stable throughout life. The epigenetic code, however, is flexible and sometimes reversible. But what shapes it? A big part of the answer is our lifestyle. What we eat, how stressed we are, how active we are, and more broadly, our environment. Let's look at a few examples. When Emma and Olivia were little, their mom used to say, "Only princesses who eat well can become queens." Was she right? Probably, because food can shape not just our health, but sometimes even who we become. Take bees. In a hive, all female bees, whether they become queens or workers, share the exact same DNA. In that sense, they're like identical twins. Worker larvae are fed what's called worker jelly, a mix of pollen, honey, and nectar. The future queen, however, is fed royal jelly, a special food in large amounts all the way to adulthood. This diet switches certain genes on and others off, transforming that larva into a queen with a longer lifespan and the ability to lay eggs, while the rest become infertile workers with shorter lives. So what makes a queen isn't her DNA, it's her diet. And all of this is thanks to epigenetics. Diet isn't the only factor. Stress can also leave an epigenetic imprint. In one experiment with mice, researchers added stress hormones to their drinking water for several weeks. The result? Chronic stress made the mice more anxious by changing the epigenetic marks of several stress response genes in the brain. A similar effect has been observed in humans. Adults who suffered abuse in childhood often have higher levels of stress hormones, as if their bodies were reprogrammed to stay on high alert long after the threat was gone. Vinclozolin was once used in vineyards to prevent mold and rot. But once inside the body, this fungicide interferes with male hormones like testosterone, which play a key role in fertility. Male rats exposed to vinclozolin before birth showed lower fertility. That's not surprising, since the chemical disrupts hormones. But here's the interesting part. Their sons, and even their grandsons, who were never directly exposed, also showed fertility problems. Again, epigenetics was at play. Environmental effects can be passed on to the next generation, even without direct exposure. The effects of vinclozolin on rat fertility are a clear example of transgenerational epigenetic effects. What mothers or fathers experience, stress, diet, or toxic exposures, can influence the health and development of their children and even grandchildren. This has been seen in humans too. For example, if a woman eats too little during early pregnancy but later has enough food, her daughter is often born with a normal weight. Yet that daughter tends to be more sensitive to high-calorie foods, and when she becomes a mother, her own daughter is more likely to be born overweight. It seems that a lack of nutrients in early pregnancy reprograms the body to store as much energy as possible, just in case the next generation faces the same scarcity. Surprisingly, maternal obesity can have similar effects to famine. When the body stores or releases too many fats, the fetus may receive signals that mimic starvation. This can program the child's body to store extra energy, increasing their risk of obesity later in life, even if they grow up eating normally. For a long time, we thought genetic code alone shaped our health and the health of future generations. That's still true. Without our genetic recipe book, we couldn't build a living body. But decades of research now show there's also a higher level of regulation, the epigenetic code. What we eat, breathe, and experience leaves marks that can last a lifetime, accumulate, and even be passed on. Even though we all start with a recipe book inherited from our parents, we can add our own notes, and sometimes those notes get handed down to our kids. Epigenetics helps explain why genetically identical people grow more and more different over time. Even identical twins don't share the same personalities. In fact, a study of over 100,000 people showed that only about 40% of our personality is shaped by our genes, while 60% comes from our environment. As Emma and Olivia's environments grew apart, so did their personalities. Diet played a role too. As kids, they ate similar meals, but once they moved out, their diets diverged. Human diets don't cause changes as dramatic as in bees, but small epigenetic changes accumulate over time, making their epigenetic codes increasingly different. Smoking is another factor. It can alter the epigenetic code, trigger chronic diseases, and even change how the body responds to medications. It's possible that smoking, along with other environmental factors, contributed to Emma's rheumatoid arthritis. Everyday exposures, pollutants, lifestyle, and stress all left their marks on the twins' epigenetic code. these marks partly explain their differences. Epigenetics is a field that's still young, and we're just beginning to understand its rules. Around the world, scientists are working to discover how environment, diet, and stress can influence genes without changing them. What we're learning is that our lifestyle choices can leave little marks on our DNA, and sometimes those marks can be passed down. It's fascinating, and it opens the door to new ways of preventing disease and protecting our health. Today, and for generations to come.